Well, again, Steve here with a few comments about what I'm going to call corporatocracy. I remember a number of years ago, I was talking to a brother of mine who's quite involved with talking about, geopolitics and what have you. And we were talking about how, the control networks within so-called countries and nations and so on, they've taken on over, thousands of years, I suppose, different forms of ocracies, right? The ocracy is basically the arc that controls the population essentially, right? And that arc is held up by columns of whatever it is that these fictitious supports. In democracy, it's held up by the support of the people supposedly. And this is why we have this symbology in the occult with like a Masonic temple where you have the arc and then you have the pillars, right? You have to have at least a minimum of two pillars to hold up the arc. Anyway, I talked about that before too, but so way back when you had like your tribalism, right? You had like just a small, very, very small, basically a large family where you would have a matriarch and a patriarch or whatever in there. But it was basically, it was always the will of the people, of course, because every once in a while, if there was a stronger guy in the tribe, he'd just bludgeon the current leader, and that would be the transition of power, right? But then as things grew, you had larger amalgamations where you'd have little kingdoms and whatever. And I'm going to miss out on a lot of different forms of ocracies here for sure. But anyway, so you had these little kingdoms, and then they would grow into what you would call larger monarchies, where you would have a monarchy is basically like almost like an empire, right? In a way. I mean, you look at even the monarchs in England. Suppose they're not English, right? They're the German monarchs that were brought into wrestle control from the drunken monarchs who were allowing way too much freedom and allowing potentially the loss of America, which they lost anyway. But anyway, so that's sort of kingdom or monarchies, as I would say, and then that sort of morphed into either broke into revolution where you had the communists take over in places like France and what have you, or the Jacobins and whatever, and different kinds of revolutions where they just got rid of the monarchy, and or in a place like England, where you eventually had a transition to this constitutional monarchy, where the barons wrestled control from the monarchs and whatever. But in all of these cases where you had monarchies, you also had a form of theocracy, because you had the church in cahoots with the monarchy. And of course, in many places, you also have outright theocracy. And I guess it would be similar. In Iran, right, even now, they have a form of theocracy, but they also have a political wing to it. It's kind of like the monarchy, the monarchy in a way. They would have and even in place like Russia. I mean, you look at Putin every time he stands up there for some sort of a official address or whatever. He has his bishop standing next door to him. It's very, very old school in a way. You had this, the blessing of God essentially on the ruling class, and then you had the whole communist approach, and also democracy coming in. Democracy it could be on any side. It can be a communist democracy. It could be a so-called capitalist society democracy. And of course, this was held up. Democracy in general goes back a long ways, but it was held up in general as the most enlightened form of any sort of a nation state. And I remember talking to my brother, this same brother, years ago, about how in this conversation that I think the question might have been to come up sometime at some point in the conversation is what's next, because it seems like there's always this changing of the guard to a different system, from tribalism to a larger system, and so on and so on. And I said, because I thought it through, and I think I'm kind of vindicated on this, which is I said it's corporatocracy. And at the time, I thought that was actually better than democracy, because in democracy you have millions of people voting, most of who know nothing about it, and they've got no vested interest, or else they got a vested interest in somebody else's affairs. So they're voting to steal other people's money and so on. But I said, at least in corporatocracy, the corporation that is heavily involved, it's got a bigger stake, it's got factories, and it's got all sorts of stuff. It has a greater influence than the average schmuck down the road, who doesn't have much investment at all in the society. So I thought it was a good idea, although I didn't see the whole picture of it. I don't think it's a good idea. But I remember when I said that, my brother, he'd just come back from Korea for a year, and he said, well, that's what it's like in Korea. They have corporatocracy there already. I mean, there's basically Samsung and, I don't know, I think it's Hyundai or whatever. There's like two or three companies that run everything, and students can protest all they want and so on. It's just they're just allowed to do it for a show basically, but it means nothing because they don't have any control whatsoever. So anyways, and it's more efficient in a way, right? Because we see it right now, even within the madness of in the U.S. politics with the Democrats. You get guys like the president of what was it, Starbucks, comes out and says how crazy the Green New Deal is. Yeah, because he's a corporate Democrat, right? And he knows that that's nonsense, and he'll only put up with it so long. But he realizes, because of course, the god of the corporate Democrats is money, of course, right? So anytime you interfere with that, so from a business side of things, the corporate Democrat is a great way to go, and that's why Trump is a corporate Democrat, because his whole god is money as well. And it's I think that's pretty obvious. And so I guess what's after that? Because I think we're in, and you see too that the business Democrat, they of course that the only thing they love is money, really. So Constitution and the rights of man and so on doesn't really matter unless it profits them, right? So I mean, you see this with, okay, they have a constitution. Most places have a constitution, but it's flagrantly abused because there's no morality behind it. You have to have morality in order for a constitution to work. And so they have the right to free speech, but when the corporations control all the mediums of speech or the media of speech, then they just censor it on there, and it's considered, oh, that's just private, so that's allowed. So even though you have free speech, effectively you don't. So of course, and the only certain people are allowed into the education system, so that the young get propagandized from a very, very young age to think that that's perfectly fine, right? So what's next? My prediction that the next ocracy is, so we had this growth of empires, right? I suspect you're going to see a chunking down of smaller empires. And you see this with, Israel as an example of that. Israel is this isolated little place which has a vast amount of influence outside of its place, outside of its sphere, but it's fairly new. I mean, the Israeli state is fairly new, and there's more and more and more people talking about it. About, hey, why can these guys get away with stuff when you're talking about diversity? They can have walls, they can have their own ethnicity over here, they can have their own language, they can dictate their own affairs and so on. And it gets harder and harder and harder for the people who want to push back, the corporate oligarchs who want to push back on things like that. It gets harder for them to do it. In the same way that the mainstream media right now has a hard time pushing back at Trump anymore, because everything they said has turned out to be a complete lie. They're complete hypocrites and so on. It's harder to push back when you've been exposed. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with a Jewish state, but when people say that you can't have your in-group preference over here, you folks, but those folks can. You can't build a border wall here, but it's perfectly fine that these people build a border wall and protect themselves and bomb everybody around them and so on. Not that that's right, but I'm just saying that it's more and more the hypocrisy is being exposed. It's being exposed in spite of the pushback from the corporate oligarchs. And yeah, so I think that, corporatocracy is in full swing, absolutely, around the world. And China is probably the template of it. China is like the new China is the poster child, if you will, of sort of fascistic corporatocracy. Like you got these vast numbers of these large institutions like Huawei and stuff like that, and whatever else there. And you got all these people who just all the working stiffs who can't watch Google and stuff. I mean, even Google's not censored enough for them, so they got to have their own system. And that's the 1984 sort of story of it. But there always is a reaction to encroachments of freedom and so on. And I think the reaction to it will be many, many little factions around the world, like little Israels, of people who identify with each other. See, in Israel, people identify with each other. They're all Jews, basically, right? So there'll be other places like that, like perhaps a little nation in South Africa where white Boers go because they just get along well together and there's less violence when they're amongst themselves rather than mixed up with a bunch of other people. And they'll wall themselves in and they'll still trade with other people around. They'll have guns pointing out all around. I think it's unfortunate. After that, and a long way down the road, we'll get to voluntarism or anarchy eventually. True anarchy, not anarchy that the mainstream media wants to tell you is a bunch of violent hoodlums. That's not anarchy. That's just terrorism, Antifa, and so on. These are not anarchists whatsoever. Anyways, what can we learn from this? Because hopefully there's something we can learn. Well, it's learning about human nature and just being able to observe and predict and to get ideas. And this was a long time ago when I talked about corporatocracy. This is like 20 or 30 years ago, and I think it's come full swing. It's ripe right now, but you're seeing the fallout of it, and we're going to see, I think, the little by little, border walls are going to become a growth industry because little places are going to break away and they're going to set up shop because it's too dangerous for certain people to live with everybody else in this corporatistic world. Because when people become too restrained by corporatocracy, there's going to be pushback in certain areas, and they're going to say, no, we're not putting up with this anymore. We're going to do our system. There's a whole variety of systems. There's going to be little communist enclaves and whatever, probably, but smaller nations, I think, is what we're going to see, which is the fracturing of the empires as the empires corrupt, especially when we see a currency meltdown. Steve here, great chatting. Oops. Talk again soon. Bye for now.